Welcome to the Journey Home program. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program, in which I have wonderful privilege of introducing to you men and women who, because of their great love for Christ and because of the different ways that God has touched their life through grace, were brought home to the Catholic Church. Speaking to you from the College Chapel in St. Patrick's Seminary, Maynooth, in County
Kildare,
I get it right this time, in Ireland. And I hope you've been enjoying these special episodes from Ireland. I mentioned a little bit about this wonderful chapel before, but there's so much to see here, but we're surrounded by hand-carved wood. It just amazes me, the expression of the intricacy and the patience that the craftsmen must have used to express their great love for the church. And it just exudes no matter where you are in this chapel. David Quinn, welcome to the Journey Home program. It's a pleasure to meet you. You've got a long story, a lot of time to tell it though, so I'm going to get out of the way real quick and invite you to begin by introducing us to your spiritual background. Where'd you come from spiritually?
Well, I'm Dublin born. I was born in 1963. Mother from Limerick, which was a rural area in the west of Ireland. Father from Dublin. Mother, typically for the time, was a stay-at-home mother after she got married. My father was a journalist, like my grandfather before him.
So you come from a long line of journalists.
Yeah, the ink is in the veins. But I got into journalism later on, but I'll come to that later. So I guess having been born in 1963, I would have been, in a certain sense, a Vatican II baby, because of course that began in 1962. Would have obviously absolutely no memory of it and didn't hear of it till years later. But nevertheless, as I was growing up, all the changes brought about to the church, either directly or indirectly, because of the council, began to take effect. So I have vague memories of, for example, kneeling at the altar rails to receive communion. I have no memory at all of the old Latin Mass. I do have some memory of the old penny catechism, the questions and answers format that was probably familiar all over the world. But then I guess in the late 60s and certainly into the 70s, and from the time my memories really begin, there would have been no structured way of teaching religion in school.
It was just lost in the process.
At all, because they were kind of at this in-between stage where they had abandoned the old way of teaching it and still hadn't designed the new way of teaching it, which still, I believe, leaves a fair amount to be desired, but that's another story as well. So I kind of was one of those Catholics that fell into a bit of a hole, and because there was no structured way to teach us the faith, it depended on the motivation and the views of the teacher. Some of them were very good, some of them weren't. But I do remember distinctly as I went through junior or primary school, when I got to about the age of 11 or 12, we had a very old-fashioned teacher called Leo McCann, long since deceased, and he was very much a product of an Ireland that would have been very conscious of being newly independent. Because at this stage, I'd say he was about 70. He was, strictly speaking, have retired. Remember, this is in the 1970s, which means he was born at the turn of the 20th century. So he'd have been an adult when Ireland became independent in 1922. And so he was very strongly nationalist-minded and very strongly Catholic, because those two often went together. And he was determined to teach us two things, Irish and religion. And he discovered, to his horror, that we knew practically nothing about religion. Because he asked us a whole series of questions about the faith. Can't quite recall what they are now, but I do know we knew none. We knew basically nothing. So he did a crash course in the basics of the faith. But I do remember him teaching us about the Pope and how the Pope was a successor of Peter and how we believe that to be the case because Jesus said to Peter, "You are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church." And I remember he just went through the basics of it. And so he gave me my foundation, I guess, in the basics of Catholicism. And if it weren't for him, I don't know where my foundation would have come from.
You wouldn't have had any seeds at all planted.
Yeah, I mean, you would have had a bit, because I don't want to knock my other teachers. It was just that this one really took care. He didn't want to leave things to chance, and he wanted to see. All through the years, there's been no examination of the level of religious knowledge among people in Irish schools. And so he was a teacher who actually took the time to find out, well, what do these guys know? Which the other teachers weren't doing. So they were assuming that we were taking in a certain amount of what we were being taught, but clearly we were taking in nothing, as he discovered.
Let me ask a question in the midst of that. Number one, I guess in the sense of looking back, there was nothing in Vatican II that demanded, called for this kind of void in catechetical teaching. That wasn't in the documents, you know. So if you look back on that time, what was it? They weren't really trying to implement what the church was teaching in terms of, but they were seeing that as an excuse.
Well, they seem to take Vatican II as a license to bring in all kinds of reforms not strictly mandated by Vatican II at all.
Yeah.
Vatican II was seen by some people, it seems to me, as a kind of super council that rendered null and void practically all other ecumenical councils before then, and they took it as a license to basically introduce their own ideas. But there was a great, as you know, a great rebellion against the church as it was, and so part of the way the church was the liturgy. Part of the way the church was how the faith was taught in schools. And so you had a massive revolution. I mean, in a sense, there was something close to year zero introduced in the church. Let's start again.
Yeah. Well, in fact, during that time of your childhood was all these new experimental changes were coming one after another.
Yeah, precisely coincided.
You know, right at the time you were being brought up?
Yeah. As I say, I only have the haziest memories of the way it would have been from beforehand. And of course, the reason that there was this rebellion against the old way of teaching the faith was because it was seen to be too rote-based, too memory-based, too formal, not attached enough to the experience of the person. And so then they began to emphasize the experiential, but what they forgot what they forgot in teaching the experiential was you got to teach the content as well. I mean, it was like trying to teach English without teaching grammar and spelling. You know, and a lot of the time anyway, what we were trying to teach experientially actually wasn't particularly going in, because most people seem to be coming out of school today not knowing much about their faith.
One other thing in that same time period, I'm not a great student of Irish history, I wish I knew a little bit more, but wasn't that also a time of beginning of unrest here in Ireland?
Well, I mean, 1969, it was the period that the campaign of violence began in the north. Prior to that, there had been a civil rights movement based on the black civil rights movement in the United States, and this was led by John Hume. And then the IRA decided this wasn't enough, and they would lead a campaign of violence against the British and to win, as they saw, the rights for Catholics. I mean, in my view, the way they should have simply followed the peaceful means being advocated and pursued by John Hume, and there was no need to go down the path of violence, but that's what happened, and of course then a period of tremendous turbulence was entered. But that actually had practically no effect.
Because you were in Dublin area.
Yes, right? And you see, even though Belfast is only 140 miles from Dublin, it may as well be on a different planet for a lot of people living down in the south, particularly children growing up, because you're not paying much attention to current affairs anyway when you're 11 and 12 years of age. It's only really what's immediately in your neighbourhood, your teachers, your parents, your friends, that have any real impact on you. And although you had this quite intense violence going on in pockets in the north, very, very little of that violence spilled down south of the border. There was only a couple of violent incidents in Dublin through the whole 30 years of the Troubles. So therefore, it was, in a sense, a world away. So therefore, it was really a distant backdrop, the Troubles, to the upbringing of most people in the south at that time.
Your parents might have been talking about around the dinner table, but...
Well, my father certainly would have been, because he was a journalist, of course.
Oh, of course,
Yeah, so therefore it would have been a pretty dominant part of his career, because he actually became a newspaper editor at around the time that the Troubles broke out. So naturally, would have been a very big part of his life.
He's in a position deciding which story is going to be on the cover and
all of that. Yeah.
So he's really...
Yeah. So I mean, at the table, you'd be hearing, you're obviously hearing about what's going on. You see it in the news. You see it in newspapers. We had so many newspapers coming in the door each day. In any case, so it was hard not to imbibe some of it.
David, to a certain extent, you were a Teflon kid. In other words, that you were at the time when that stuff was happening, but maybe it didn't affect you directly. What about your parents and their faith?
Well, I mean, I would have been brought up in a house that was Catholic in the conventional sense. I mean, remember, this is a time when 90 to 95% of people in Ireland were going to Mass each week. It was simply something you did, and it was something you didn't really think about. Therefore, I would have gone to Mass each Sunday. But having compared my experience to that of some of my friends, and certainly of their parents, our household wasn't particularly intensely Catholic household at all. So you go into other kids' households and you'd see the Sacred Heart picture up on the wall. You could bless yourself with holy water as you went in. There was none of that in my house at all. There was not a holy picture to be seen. I think that was probably to some degree because I was brought up in the household of a journalist whose main interest was politics. Okay. And what was on the pedestal in my household wasn't the church, it was the Fine Gael party, which was, in terms of Irish politics, it would have been very much opposed to the IRA, and it would have been on a particular side in the Irish Civil War at the time of independence. I won't go into the detail, but it would make a lot of sense to any Irish people watching when I say that I was brought up in a Fine Gael household and it was on the pedestal, so not the church. My mother, though, in terms of the sort of, if you like, the internal spiritual life of the family, as I say, there was none of these holy pictures up on the walls. However, she used to try to get us to say grace and the Angelas. She herself used to say her prayers every night. But over time, we gradually beat the Angelas and saying prayer, saying grace before meals out of her. She said it then privately herself, but we said, oh, listen, Mum, why do you want to be saying this? Why do you want to be making us say our prayers? We don't want to say our prayers. And so in the end, when we're reaching our teens, she kind of gave up the ghost. But when she was growing up, it would have been out of the question that you could have said that to your parents. You know, you're going to say grace before meals, like it or not. You're going to say the Angelas at midday and at 6 o'clock, like it or not. But we didn't like it. No particular reason. It was all quite ill thought out. We just didn't want to say it.
Was it, as happens in America sometimes, where at least the male children usually follow the father? I mean, was that what was happening, you think?
Well, my father went to Mass, though. He went to Mass. So it wasn't that he was an unbeliever by any means. Right. I mean, he's still alive. My mother died 2.5 years ago. Like, he wasn't an unbeliever. My mother clearly wasn't. She'd have been more pious than he was. But that would have been a very Irish thing as well. Okay. The mother would have been more pious, usually, than the father. But nonetheless, when politics was the dominant theme of the household, the church wasn't. That's going to have a certain influence, you know. And you know, your if you like, your worldview has been formed mainly through politics rather than through the church. So the church wasn't a particularly dominant thing in our household. It was to say our Catholicism was purely conventional. My mother's went deeper than that. Mine certainly didn't. It was nominal only. Went to Mass each week. I had a certain interest in religion because I had an interest in anything that kind of exercised the mind a little bit. So if there was an interesting discussion going on in class, whether it was history class or religion class or English class, you know, you take a certain interest. You always kind of liked and appreciated when a teacher engaged you in a bit of stimulating discussion, and that happened all too rarely in RE class.
Well, you're brought up in a country where, you know, everywhere you go, you're running into 1,000-year-old Christian history. I mean, were you aware of that as a young man?
Well, no, you completely take it for granted.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it simply is part of the background.
Yeah,
it's part of the furniture of the household, as it were, and so you just don't see it. But when I was going through secondary school, high school, as you'd call it, I mean, again, no particular structure to the way religion was taught. It was hit and miss depending on the teacher you got. I was taught,
Catholic school?
Yes, okay. Vincentians ran it.
All right.
There was a few Vincentian priests still left around teaching at the school at that time. There's none left in my school, in my old school now. They've all had to move on to other things because either they got too old or they died, and they certainly haven't been replaced. So therefore, there's no priest teaching in my old school, to St. Paul's. But again, as I say, the teaching of RE was hit and miss. So some with some good teachers, some bad teachers, some with different teachers, but no structure to it. So therefore, too much was left to chance. I was involved in the St. Vincent de Paul Society in school because the Vincentians heavily emphasised social justice and going out and visiting the people who are alone or poor or whatever. So that would have had a certain influence. But school and religion, I would have passed through school, and apart from that teacher I mentioned earlier in primary school, religion would have left a pretty light impression on me, it has to be said. But also I was growing up at a time when the rebellion against the church was beginning. And the rebellion was also beginning against sort of nationalist Ireland. There was a whole sort of backlash against the way Ireland wanted to be post-independence, which was very nationalist and very Catholic. And as a middle-class Dublin kid, the mood was anti-nationalist and anti-Catholic. Not ferociously.
Because those were seen pretty much together?
Yeah, they were, because of the history of Ireland. The English tried to eradicate the Catholic religion in Ireland, and so part of the national identity was seen to be our Catholicism, and so nationalism and Catholicism got intertwined, and the identity of the country was going to be very much Irish and Catholic. After independence in 1922, we kind of became super Catholic, and the church became rather domineering and authoritarian, and it led to the inevitable backlash. And it was led by, I guess, the people who would have come to adulthood in the 60s, which would have been similar to in the US. and even more so probably in the 70s. Now, I still wasn't an adult, I was in my teens in the 70s, but you could see it going on, and you couldn't help but be influenced. I mean, I would have never been anti-church, because I didn't grow up with the authoritarian church. Remember, I came after Vatican II. So all these stories I heard about overly domineering, bullying priests and nuns, I just didn't see any of that personally. But it was clearly a generation who had seen it at first hand and didn't like it and rebelled against it. And they didn't like the church at all. But because I didn't have that personal experience, I didn't have to rebel against that. However, I grew up pretty much indifferent to the church. I just didn't really, I had slight sympathy to it, but didn't really care about it too much one way or the other.
All right. So one way we describe that in youth work is, you want Jesus to be on the center of your heart, but sometimes he's just one of 1,000 things in your life. So it sounds like the church is just one of many things that are part of your life, not the center of your life, just one of many things.
Well, it was simply going to Mass each week, and that was, and maybe a bit of St. Vincent de Paul, and that was about the sum total.
Which was good service, but not necessarily being committed to why you were doing it other than serving the poor.
No.
So when you leave, I mean, it's the next big step of your journey when you leave secondary school and you're off on your own, more or less.
Well, I was into university, but you see, your average Irish university student, if they are going to university in Dublin, stays living at home. Right, you don't leave home. And very few live on campus. And if you're living on campus, you're probably from outside of Dublin, because those, that kind of accommodation is made available to the students from the country. So I was living at home, and I was only 3 miles away from my university. And I did a Bachelor of Business Studies, because when I left school in 1981, unemployment was high and it was getting higher, and the economy was in an absolutely dreadful state. And Ireland had run up a gigantic national debt as high as some third world countries compared to its gross national product. Unemployment around the time I was in university was 16%. Emigration was extremely high. You had entire classes of graduates and school leavers immediately leaving the country and going to mainly the US, Britain and Australia. And so against that kind of background, I decided, even though my natural inclination would have been to do an arts degree, I decided I better do something practical that would enhance my employment prospects. So that's why I did a Bachelor of Business Studies. So I spent, the usual number of years in the university, and religion would have played practically zero aspect in my life. I was still going to Mass because I was still living at home. And it wasn't like I was going to Mass to please my parents. It was still more or less something you did. This is in the early to mid 80s. So really, in terms of religion, my university years were a great big blank.
Was University of Dublin, is that your University of Dublin?
It was called Dublin City University.
Okay,
it was a new university.
Secular university or church related?
No, secular.
Completely independent, all right. So by definition, therefore, you wouldn't have had religion classes
no,
requirement of any sort?
No, I mean, there was a chaplain. There was a chaplain for the main sort of religious faiths in the university, but the poor chaplain, I'm afraid, I'm not quite sure what he did with his time, because few enough people, were too interested in going to him. They just went about their lives quite apart from the faith. Some sure were involved, but none of my peer group were, except, as I say, in the purely conventional sense of maybe going to Mass each week.
So then when you left college, did you get that job in the business degree? Did it work?
No, I left in 86, and I decided I'm going to see a bit of the world first. So I decided to go to Australia.
Really?
So myself and and a classmate headed out to Australia, and we arrived there in December 1986. I was 23 years of age, and I arrived in Sydney. And it was at that point that I stopped going to Mass. I kind of went a couple of times, but the gaps between the visits to Mass grew and grew until finally I wasn't going at all. So there would have been a period of a couple of years, I guess, when I wasn't going. No conscious rebellion, just got out of the habit. Just drifted away without really thinking about it at all. But in Sydney, I met this fellow who, in retrospect, probably has a kind of new age perspective on life, but he was also a guy who was very good at asking the right questions, and he had thought things through himself, and he discovered that I kind of liked asking questions and liked discussing issues, and so he kind of quickly found out I was working with him. It was in a marketing company of all things, and he discovered that I had a pretty poorly formed worldview, and it was kind of halfway between a religious worldview and a secular worldview, because, as I say, even though I drifted away, I was never hostile, and so my worldview was, quite a bit informed by my Catholicism, because it was sort of unavoidable having grown up in the atmosphere in which I'd grown, but I hadn't thought about it, I hadn't formed a worldview, and I'd half a foot in the secular camp, so he basically said, you'd better choose. So I had that in mind when I moved to Brisbane, which is a city about 600 miles north of Sydney, where I met my wife-to-be. And I met her very quickly after arriving in Brisbane. This is less than a year after arriving in Australia. And my wife is Baptist by background. And so I began going along to her Baptist church just a little bit. But it was a thriving evangelical community. In this evangelical community, for the first time ever, I encountered quite a subset of this church congregation who were living their lives kind of like described in the Acts of the Apostles. And I'd never seen that fully lived out Christian faith before, and I must say it impressed me deeply. Now you had at the other end, you had some ultra-fundamentalists who like, I don't know if you're familiar with them, these Jack Chick comic books.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Which are just hideously anti-Catholic, but they were really only a minority. So at this point, I guess I was a sort of drifting. But I still had this...
Did you read some of those comics?
Oh, I had a look at some of them. They were pretty horrifying.
Yeah, that's right.
But they didn't take me in the least, because they were just so patently ridiculous. Anyway, I encountered them a little bit later. But I was aware of a certain fundamentalist strain there, but it was a minority strain, and it certainly wasn't represented by the pastor, who to me, to this day, was the ideal pastor. He was just wonderfully orthodox in his Christian faith. He had a great sort of pastoral outreach to the members of his church. He had a great evangelical outreach beyond his church, and he was sort of a deeply compassionate man without sacrificing any bit of the gospel at all. And so I was lucky to encounter him. And of course, you know, the evangelicals, they very much lay on the line what you must do to be saved.
Right.
The way it was put in this church was accept Jesus into your heart as your Lord and Saviour. And so I would have heard this a couple of times. Now in the meantime, I'm falling in love, right? So there's a whole lot going on.
Well, that makes you pretty susceptible to what they're preaching there too.
Of course. So, so like I'm in a new country. I've met my wife-to-be. I'm kind of adrift in terms of my view of things. Including, you know, do I want to be a Christian? What kind of Christian? Do I want to be, or will I just give it all up? And I'm going to this new church a little bit, not every week, but I'm going along because I have this new girlfriend and I want to kind of impress her, and I want to impress her parents, so I'm going along to this church. But that church had a profound effect on me, because in fact I did answer, if you like, the evangelical call, and it was an extremely deep and profound conversion experience. There was the conviction of sin, which I felt extremely deeply, and nobody had discussed any of this with me. Nobody had said what I should be feeling is just what I felt, but I also felt a feeling of having been saved and a feeling of redemption and so on. And that, of course, needless to say, sparked off a huge search in me for answers, because I wanted to see, does this make sense? Is what I'm experiencing making sense? And so at that point, I actually came extremely close to giving up Catholicism. I certainly wasn't going to take up a secular worldview at this stage. I was likely to become a Protestant, evangelical, and probably Baptist. And what pulled me back, well, the intellectual point that nearly pulled me into the Protestant church was the classical debate between Catholicism and Protestantism over the doctrine of justification, that is, how are we saved? Yeah. And my kind of potted version was the Catholic Church teaches you're saved by your own good works, because I never thought any differently, and that certainly was the impression you'd get going through school. And
which is what Jack Chick also says the Catholic Church teaches, and probably what the Baptists may have presumed the Church teaches, right?
And they say you're saved through faith in Jesus alone. And so I had a look at the letter to Romans. It was suggested to me a look at that, and it certainly seemed pretty clear-cut that the Protestants were right and we were wrong. So I then, when I was working at this stage in an insurance company in Brisbane city centre, but there was a Catholic Central Library in the city centre, and I began going in there and looking for books, and I found this book called, I think it was called Religions of Mankind by Otto Kahrer. I think it was a German theologian from the 30s. And he dealt exactly with this point about the doctrine of justification and explained the Catholic position. And it is that we're saved only through Jesus, although it's somewhat different to the Protestant teaching. Right. I don't fully understand, I must say. I'm no theologian. But his answer satisfied me. And it was his answer that kept me in the Catholic Church. So one thing led to another. I began to read people like Karl Adam, The Spirit of Catholicism. Yes. I began to read sort of the classical apologists like G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, who, as we know, can be read by evangelicals and Catholics with equal profit. Lewis really was answering for me the questions that the secular-minded people were putting to the church. People like Karl Adams were answering for me the questions that my Protestant friends might be putting to the church. And I see the people like Karl Adams, or Karl Adam, and people like Lewis, people like Chesterton, were answering those questions extremely well. And Lewis was answering the questions that the secularists might put very well. I also remember around that time reading Richard John Newhouse's book, The Catholic Moment, or The Naked Public Square. Read The Closing of the American Mind, obviously by a secular thinker, but it was still a bit of an eye-opener for me, because at this stage I'm still in gestation, I'm still forming my worldview. But I remember, as I sort of read myself more deeply into the faith, being kind of resentful that I hadn't been taught any of this before. And why did I have to come across it myself? And so this is all going on in my sort of mid to late 20s. I got married at the age of 26. I got married in my wife's Baptist church, but with the dispensation of the Catholic Church. So therefore it was a validly recognised marriage in the eyes of the Catholic Church. So I'm living in Australia for 6.5 years. But at that point I'm sort of, to my own satisfaction, more or less answering the questions I had in my mind. The Catholic faith made sense to me. I was working all this time in this insurance/finance company in Brisbane. But I never had intended staying in Australia. I'd gone for a year to begin with, met Rachel. The year became 6.5 years. My father, during all this time, was sending me back clippings from Ireland and newspaper clippings, and I would see at this point the church is coming under the most savage attack, because it was around the mid-90s that Bishop Eamon Casey had to stand down from as Bishop of Galway thanks to a scandal involving a lady called Annie Murphy. He'd had a child with her, and of course that just caused the most immense scandal in Ireland, because nothing like it had ever been heard. It couldn't be suspected that one of the bishops would have been involved in an affair like that. Then came the clerical sex abuse scandals, which were much worse. And in retrospect, the Bishop Eamon Casey thing seems to belong to an age of innocence, because it involved a grown woman and not boys. But this led to an enormous outbreak of this sort of anti-Catholic feeling that I've been mentioning earlier, gave enormous vent to it. And from these newspaper clippings my father was sending me, I was noticing there seemed to be very few people standing up and trying to explain the church's position. Because it wasn't just getting slaughtered over the clerical sex abuse cases, which was fair enough. This was being used to attack the church across the board. It was also, by the way, in the 80s, there were great social debates taking place in Ireland about issues like abortion and divorce. Before that, there had been a debate about contraception, because contraception was illegal in Ireland. That's how Catholic a society we were. And so there was this great attempt to liberalise the laws in Ireland, and there was a great resistance to it also, and there was very bitter social debates going on in the 1980s over these sort of issues. The only one that has not been won by liberal secular opinion would be the abortion issue. It remains illegal here, practically speaking, even though about 6,000 women a year go to England from here for abortion. So this is all taking place, and my father sent me all these clippings about these kind of debates, and I just see there seems to be practically nobody standing up to defend the church. So I said, I'm going to go back to Ireland.
How long were you married there in?
I was married 3 years.
Before you came back?
Yeah.
Was your wife staying Baptist, and you were going to Catholic Church at the time?
Yeah.
How was that working out between?
Well, I'll come to that.
Okay, you're going to wait. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll be back in just a second. See you a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home program. Our guest is David Quinn. You're just on the edge of leaving Australia in your story.
It was 1993, still working for this finance insurance company, married at this stage nearly 4 years. So in March 93, we sat down in Ireland.
With the goal, you said?
Well, more or less, yeah. I mean, I was going to see what was going to happen, right? But initially I worked back in my field. My wife was a nurse. She got work in Ireland quicker than I did. We're arriving back at a time when the recession I referred to earlier hadn't quite lifted. So unemployment is still quite high. We were still pretty much in the economic doldrums. We hadn't yet arrived into this period of enormous economic boom that Ireland has had over the last 10 years. We are now, per head of population, by the way, the second richest country in the world, which few enough people know. Only Luxembourg, per head of population, is richer.
What happened?
Well,
that's another story.
Yeah,
but
I mean, we just got the economic formula right. But we got it dramatically and spectacularly right, to a point where we're just this sort of economic model for economists all over the world to come and study and say, well, what did Ireland do right?
Is it filtering down to the folk?
Yes, it is. It is. I mean, unemployment, which was 16%, is now about 3 or 4%. So that has to have an effect. And so poverty rates have been slashed in Ireland compared to what it would have been. But back in '93, things were still pretty bad. So I had difficulty finding work. Rachel found work as a nurse fairly quickly, and that actually allowed us to keep financially afloat. Because otherwise we would have been back to Australia. We were given it 6 months initially. So her nursing skills allowed us to stay in Ireland. And I got working for a while in the contract in the bank. But was a particular editor, Damien Kybert of the Sunday Business Post, was recommended to me. Despite the name of the paper, it had more eclectic sort of tastes and outlook than simply business. He could see that the church was having a pretty rough time in the media generally, and it was suggested to me I send him in the odd article. So I sent him in a couple of opinion pieces. He seemed to be favourably impressed. We met, and I ended up writing a weekly column. So this would have been about a year after arriving in Ireland in 1994. And because I was sort of sticking out like the proverbial sore thumb, because there were so few voices like mine in Ireland, I began to attract a bit of attention and began to get invited onto radio programmes and television programmes, which is, needless to say, daunting at first. Because you're suddenly on live radio with an audience of maybe 200,000 or 300,000, and you're up against some very seasoned debaters, and you're just hoping you don't make a complete fool of yourself. But you manage to stay afloat, and you manage to keep your head above water. And your confidence in yourself grows, and in your ability to debate reasonably well, one thing led to another. Sunday Business Post column became the Sunday Times column. Sunday Times, which is the English paper, has an Irish edition, and I became in 1996. That is 2 years after getting the Sunday Business Post column, the editor of the Irish Catholic, which is the main selling Catholic paper in Ireland.
Well, that's a huge step.
Well, that's probably not quite as dramatic as it sounds, because saying it's the biggest selling Catholic paper in Ireland, people probably think they're selling like 100,000 a week. Well, first of all, it's a weekly paper, it's not a daily paper. Second of all, it doesn't sell anything like that. It sells about maybe 26,000, 27,000 a week, which is reasonably respectable.
Yeah.
But it is in no way, shape or form the sort of paper that's reaching into every other household in Ireland. But it was still quite a thing to get. Yeah. And particularly at that time. So it was quite a major challenge. Circulation was going down at that time, and so there was a bit of a rescue job to be done as well.
But you became now the voice you had in this, you said more eclectic paper. Now you're editing. Would you consider that maybe though still the largest journalistic voice for the church within Ireland, or one of the larger?
Well, the Irish Catholic certainly would have been, as a pure Catholic paper, it would have been the main. As I say, the main Catholic paper by far, but it kind of slipped into a ghetto, by which I mean it wasn't reaching anyone other than the people who were directly buying it, whereas another newspaper can have an influence beyond itself and its readers, because it's getting, people of influence are reading it, and it's having an influence upon their thinking, and they're the ones who have control of the levers of power. They're the ones who can make things happen. So if you're influencing them, you're influencing the world beyond the newspaper and its readers. Whereas the Irish Catholic wasn't reaching out beyond that at all. Now, I've got to say, it's still not reaching much beyond its readers, unfortunately, but it did begin to get more noticed. Certainly within the world of the church and among people who'd have influence within the church, it began to get more noticed.
In the States, we have a phrase, you're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
You're writing to those, but the ones you really want to touch aren't buying that paper.
Yeah, but it would have had an important role.
Encourage those that are reading it.
Yeah, because remember, what's happening here is people are becoming very discouraged, because all they're seeing is bad news about the church, and a lot of it was genuine bad news.
Well, you had read it through the articles your dad sent you.
Yeah.
When you landed, what'd you think? What'd you find?
Well, it was about what I had gleaned from the newspapers. Okay. There was a very bad atmosphere around the church. Morale was extremely low. It still is extremely low. Probably come to that a little bit later as well.
Sure.
But back then it was just practically rock bottom. There just seemed to be continual attacks going on. But a lot of what was happening was invited by the frankly very poor leadership and stewardship of the church in the years previous to this, because obviously, and the same thing has happened in America, the sex abuse scandals were extremely badly handled. And so the church deserved an awful lot of the criticism it was receiving, unfortunately. But as I say, when you see the attack, you see, in my editorship, I made a clear distinction between the teachings of the church on the one hand and the way the church was run from day to day on the other. And the way the church is run from day to day, to my mind, was fair game for criticism, so long as the criticism was fair. And as I say, unfortunately, a lot of it was. But there was still a big job to be done defending the teachings, because they were coming under attack as well, and they were suffering a lot of collateral damage, if you like, from those attacks. But they were also being attacked directly, because naturally people didn't want to hear what the church has to say about family life and sex before marriage and contraception and abortion and divorce and all that kind of thing. So it was sustaining enormous direct hits as well.
I was going to say, especially if the people in the pew who are being called to live by those standards, they have come to the conclusion that dropping those standards aren't living by those standards. I mean, that makes it particularly difficult.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon you equate the problems with the teachings and say that, they're hand in glove, and that's a problem.
I mean, humanly speaking, if people aren't practicing what they preach, as you say, a lot of people fall away. Although, mind you, I mean, my line is always, if 99.9% of the population are hypocrites, it gives you no excuse to be one as well.
Right.
You judge the standards in and of themselves and not according to the people who are trying to live up to them. Right. You've got to just look at them independently. Are those standards worth living by? I'll try to live by them. I don't care if nobody else is. Obviously, it's encouraging and helpful of other people living by them, but it shouldn't make you fall if somebody else is falling.
That's what Jesus talked about when he said the narrow gate. There's the wide gate, and there's the narrow gate.
Yeah.
You came from, in the midst of this, you have this voice that you probably didn't expect to have when you came from Australia, but all of a sudden, wow, this door has been opened to you to at least be able to speak freely of your Catholic perspective. Let's talk about your wife on this journey. I mean, you're from Australia, now you're here in England. Is this a good time to ask that question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, she, to this day, would remain Protestant. Clearly the fact that we're married to one another, being of different branches of the Christian faith, means we must be fairly ecumenical minded. She certainly didn't come from the Jack Chick end of her church. And you see, don't forget, look, I am not going to put pressure on her to convert, right? All you can do is sort of put the food on the table, make it smell and look attractive, and hopefully taste nice, and then, she might take it herself. But I'm not going to force feed her, okay? And she's coming to Ireland at a time, again, when the church is coming under massive attack. And, she'd have come along to Mass with me, and I'm afraid to say not been terribly impressed by what she heard and saw, whereas she'd go along to her church here in Ireland and get very good, solid preaching. And the Mass means very little to her, because it's so different from, her low church background, which is shorn of ritual and liturgy and ornaments and so on. And so it takes a considerable leap to get from that kind of low church background to the much more high church atmosphere of the Catholic Church, even though we are much more low church in terms of our liturgy than we used to be before Vatican II. It's still a big step from her own way of worshipping. And so she would go along nowadays to a Presbyterian church about a 20-minute drive from us, from where we live, and it would be sort of what I would term moderate evangelical. It would have very good outreach to the local community. It has been growing fast, because that's another part of the story. It's that while evangelical Christians are still a very small minority in Ireland, they've grown about tenfold in the last 20 years. Now that's, when I say tenfold, that's gone from about 2,000 to about 20,000. But if on the other hand you would have come back here in 30 years' time and it's grown tenfold again, or even fivefold, then it's beginning to become a significant enough presence in Ireland. Because what's actually happening is, while there is a certain drift away from the church that's taken people very far away from Christianity itself, there's some people who have drifted away, but have done so without really having thought about it, without having become hostile to the church, without having really become secular-minded, down into their bones. And so they still have a sympathy for a sort of Christian message that is conveyed to them well. And a lot of the evangelical churches, of course, do that very well, and their services are often extremely family-orientated. They take good care of kids. They have very good Sunday school.
Yeah.
And so the sort of competitive religious marketplace that now exists, the Catholic Church isn't competing against that all that well, unfortunately.
I know, for example, in the States, there's a huge growth of what you might call Christian indifferentism. In other words, all that's necessary is Jesus. The church, all those other things are not necessary. Where you go to church doesn't matter. I mean, that's running rampant, not just among those outside the Catholic Church, but even in many Catholic mindsets. They sometimes feel a bit hesitant to proclaim the church in the way that the church used to be able to take a stand on it. Is that what you would say is also what's happening here?
Yeah, it's certainly becoming the case here, because I would meet the occasional Catholic, or at least sort of baptized Catholic, who would go along to a Protestant evangelical church, and they still consciously think of themselves as Catholic, and they don't think of themselves as having converted. They don't see themselves as Presbyterian or Baptist or evangelical or whatever the case may be. As you say, they simply found the church that works for them. And that's good enough. And they're not interested in doctrine. They're not interested in joining up all the dots and seeing if I can square that doctrine with that doctrine. They just don't think in those categories at all. They feel like
they're being fed. So, I mean, that's why they would go.
It's the postmodern condition.
Yeah.
And if I can refer back a little bit to my earlier story, one of the themes that was kind of in my head, one of the questions that was in my head would have been a very typical modern question. Who am I to decide what's right and wrong? I decide what's right and wrong for me. And I certainly have no right to be imposing my views upon other people, which is a very kind of modern attitude, postmodern attitude. And so I remember reading this book which explained what this sort of moral relativism was all about and where it led, because of course if morality is a matter of opinion, if you push that to its logical conclusion, then somebody says, well, so is rape, is it simply a matter of opinion to say it's wrong? And the person says, well, of course not, rape is wrong. Well, in that case, morality is not simply a matter of opinion. And in fact, sometimes you've got a duty to impose, quote unquote, your morality, to protect people, to protect the weak from the strong, and so on. And so that led me pretty quickly to see through moral relativism, because if you want to go down that path, you end up in nihilism, where you believe in no objective standards whatsoever. So that was very important. But that led to me kind of, if there is an objective truth and an objective morality, that led to me wanting to sort of join up the dots of doctrine, and I wanted it to make sense. But that seems to be pretty uncharacteristic of how the modern mind works, because, as I say, people only want to see, is the faith I have, does it work for me? Not does it make sense to me, does it work for me? Does it sustain me through life? And if they give a yes in answer to that question, they're happy with that. They don't want to join up the dots. They don't need it to make sense.
Are you, well, first of all, are you still the editor of that newspaper?
No, since 2003, this is after 7 years nearly as editor of the Irish Catholic, I became the religious and social affairs correspondent of the Irish Independent, which is the main selling daily paper here. So obviously that's a world away from where I was working.
So now you've got that voice that cuts across that line that you wanted to be able to.
Well, yeah,
right?
but I mean, you got to bear in mind, I mean, like I wouldn't have that job if I was seen to be completely partisan. Because you see, when I would go on programs, and as I still go on programs, I try to describe, because usually I'm on a program to discuss some particular issue that's facing the church at a given moment. So it could be the election of the last pope. And so you're on in analytical mode as opposed to polemical mode. You're describing who are the candidates, who's likely to be elected, what are the issues facing the church. And I would often give both sides of the argument. So an example, a few years ago, there was a great row here involving intercommunion, because our president, head of state, now she's really a figure. She would have very little executive power. She presented herself for communion in a Church of Ireland cathedral, and that would be the equivalent of our Episcopalian, or rather of your Episcopalian church. Right. And as a Catholic, she presented herself for communion here, and therefore breached the Church's rule on intercommunion. So there's a great big row about intercommunion. So I found myself in questions and answers, which is a very big current affairs program here, where the audience get to put questions to you, and you have sort of a panel of various...
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, politicians and journalists and commentators and what have you. So the question under examination was, well, what is the church teaching here? And so, I mean, I would have said, well, look, here's my opinion here. The church teaches that We don't share communion with Christians of non-Catholic faith because we think, A, you must believe it to be the body and blood of Christ, and B, sharing communion indicates you are in communion, full communion.
Right.
And so it is a sign of full communion when you share communion with others. And I said that's the Catholic position. I said the position of the Church of Ireland, on the other hand, is that shared communion is a step along the road to full unity. And so they have a different view. So we say it's the culmination of unity, they say it's a step along the path to unity. And so you get a reputation, I guess, for being objective, because if I was seen to be completely partisan all the time, I would never
ask you for your opinion anymore.
I would never have been employed by the Irish Independent then, because I simply would have been seen as a propagandist. And you can't be seen as that, and you're less effective anyway. You're more effective if you're seen to be saying it as it is. And so, for example, when I'd been on programmes, and I was on numerous programmes discussing the scandals, I would be pretty forthright in my criticisms of the church and how it was handled. On the other hand, when you'd hear somebody on the same debate as me saying it's all to do with celibacy, I'd have to say, hang on a minute, that's a bit simplistic, and give the reasons why that was simplistic. So on the one hand, you're prepared to criticise, but on the other hand, you're prepared to defend us.
Well, let me ask you, just that the scandal issue, I know one thing that the media didn't present very well in the States. I mean, they made a huge issue out of the fact of what was happening in the Catholic Church, but they didn't often mention that the problem was equally as true, if not greater, in the non-Catholic churches in America, and the statistics show that. Was that brought out here?
Well, don't forget that the Catholic Church is still easily the dominant church in the island.
So it's a different
scenario here. Because, I mean, 95% of people who live in the south of Ireland are at least nominally Catholic, they're baptised Catholic. About 50% of them still go to Mass. So we're overwhelmingly Catholic, and the journalists are overwhelmingly Catholic, at least by background. And so naturally, the Catholic Church is pretty much the only game in town. And so nearly all the clerical sex abuse scandals had, by definition, to involve priests. But still, I mean, given the American experience and how there was super concentration of the Catholic Church, you have to suspect that even if the Catholic Church was a minority here, it still would have got this attention. And I think it's because, I mean, even though it's a minority church in America, it is the most high-profile one.
Right.
And because of this celibacy rule, which strikes people as unnatural, and is going to result in unnatural manifestations, and they think that pedophilia is Exhibit A in their case, proving that you can't be celibate without doing harm.
And of course, the statistics don't show that. The statistics show that in the other denominations, the other churches, the statistics, at least in America, is that the problem was there too, and there's no celibacy there.
Well, even beyond that though, because I mean, you've had social workers, teachers, scoutmasters, and so on. So basically what actually appears to be the case with regard to the child sex abuse scandals is that people with that inclination will be attracted to whatever profession will put them in contact with children. And so naturally the priesthood is one of them, but so is the teaching profession, so is scoutmaster, and I obviously don't want to tar any of these professions with that brush. I'd be obviously particularly sensitive, being a Catholic, not to do that, but it is still a statement of fact that these professions will disproportionately attract people with that kind of sexual inclination, unfortunately. And then in our naivety, we assume that people will be attracted to such professions out of pure altruism, but there was a small minority who were attracted for anything other than that.
Yeah, I'm thinking the scandal really hit full force about 20 years or so, started to after the confusion that followed Vatican II. And when you have a breakdown in catechesis, it's going to eventually have an effect on conscience. And especially if we go through a period where the spiritual battle isn't, people aren't aware that each one of us are in a spiritual battle. We've got the voices from the world, we got our own flesh we're fighting against, we got the enemy that's trying to influence our thinking. And if we're not aware of that, we're ignorant of that, we can be dupes to it.
I mean, it is a certain point of that argument, but the Irish experience is that some of the people who were carrying out the abuse were ordained long before the 1980s or the 1970s, because the church, at least, there was a number of religious orders like the Christian Brothers and the Mercy Sisters, which are the two big Irish orders, ran these institutions called industrial schools, where kids were basically taken off the street because they were being neglected or abused or whatever the case may be. Sometimes they were juvenile delinquents, brought into these schools called industrial schools, where they were taught a trade for the industries. And these were run since the 19th century. And there are people alive today who were abused back in the 1930s in these places, when you had very much the pre-Vatican II church. So unfortunately, you had these cases cropping up.
Well, it's an interesting thought. As you look at Ireland, then, the problems that you were going through, in a certain sense, didn't affect you directly in the 60s and all that. So in a sense, this wasn't really even a direct connect to Vatican II per se. It was brewing.
Yes. Yes,
brewing
because
for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, you can only speculate because nobody has done any kind of comprehensive study of the background of the abusers. Sure. But I dare say some of them were coming out of homes where they were abused themselves. And in Ireland, in poverty-stricken circumstances, you might have had a family of 10 children living under the same roof, small house. Yeah. And those kind of impoverished, overcrowded conditions, incest seems to occur, right? And that's going to be carried on, unfortunately.
So what do you see as the trajectory of Ireland right now and the condition of things in terms of the faith?
Well, we are probably where the United States was about 20 years ago. That is, we are in a period of rejection of the faith, I would say. We are probably the Vocations black spot of the world at the present time. The Dublin Diocese, for example, which has 1 million Catholics, at least in the nominal sense, had no ordinations this year for the first time in its 1,000-year history.
That's amazing.
So far as we know.
Which is amazing when you think that at one point this school, where we're at, in 1860s was the largest seminary in the world. Yeah,
it was overflowing. It was overflowing until quite recently. So last year there was only 10 ordinations in the entire country for the 26 dioceses. And maybe that number again for the 135 religious orders that are based in Ireland. They produced maybe 10 or 15 ordinations between the whole lot of them. Vocations are ordinations are professions. I'm including here the convents. So you're talking about very, very small numbers. In fact, if they planned to have such small numbers, they wouldn't have achieved it. Mass attendance, which was 90% when I was growing up, is probably about 50% now, and the demographic is quite bad. There has been a certain loss of nerve on the part of church leaders because they have come in for such a battering, and because they have themselves made mistakes, for example, with the sex abuse scandals, that there's a certain reluctance now to put the head above the parapet. So there's a certain lack of leadership in the church. Unfortunately, at present. So nobody is, if you like, hoisting the banner high of the Catholic Church. And so I would say we have to get a few more years out of the recent climate and atmosphere before people begin to recover their nerve. So the thing to do would be possibly to come back here in about 10 years' time and find out what's going on, and maybe there might be, because then you might find out, let's say 10 or 15 years' time, the mass attendance has dropped further. However, there are signs of recovery here and there, and the people who are still going, would be more committed to the faith and not simply going out of the habits of a lifetime.
One of the things that we're seeing as a hopeful sign in the States is our new seminarians that we are seeing, our young priests are just it's exciting to see their faith, their commitment, their desire for conversion, and in general, it seems that the majority of our new seminarians are 100% faithful and committed to being loyal to the magisterium. Are you seeing that even in your small numbers?
Yes, in small numbers you are beginning to see it. I mean, one of the organisations in Ireland that has been to the forefront of various of the social debates I mentioned earlier about issues like abortion is the Pro-Life Campaign. And a lot of the people involved in it are young and educated, and very much of both sexes, because you probably have 50-50 male, female involved with it, and they're coming out of the universities, and they would be very energetic in their faith. So that would be a sort of early glimmer in Ireland of what you're seeing now to a much greater extent in the United States. But I think Americans are probably surprised to find out how, in what kind of ill health the church in Ireland currently is.
Often we think of Ireland, we think of Knock, we think of the sites of pilgrimage to St. Patrick.
But actually, when you mention Knock, you see, here's a kind of a sort of paradoxical thing. The places of the Marian sites, the Marian shrines, are still doing very well. So on the Feast of the Assumption, about something like 75,000 people still descend on Knock. And a lot of Irish still go abroad each year to places like Medjugorje, despite its sort of uncertain status officially within the church, and many go to Lourdes and Fatima. So you still have this kind of traditional faith residing. And there was kind of, as well, a sort of contraindication of, in terms of the decline of the faith a number of years ago. This is about 1999 or so. The relics of St. Therese at the Little Flower were brought to Ireland, and hundreds of thousands of people all over the country turned out either out of curiosity or to venerate them. But the fact that that was happening at all amazed, if you like, the cynical, secular-minded commentators of Dublin and our equivalent, if you like, of Manhattan or Beltway commentators, you know. And that really was an amazing thing to see. And it just flabbergasted everybody, including myself, because you just wouldn't have expected it, that something was still surviving for some reason in some fashion.
Well, that's a positive thing to build on for the future for Ireland. If you were to, in a final word, maybe give a message to the folk on what they ought to do in their prayers for Ireland, what are the things we need to most focus on for the good of the future?
I think of George Weigel's book, the one he wrote called "The Courage to be Catholic." And I think that's what has to be prayed for. And in fact, when the bishops of Ireland made their last ad limina visit to the previous pope a number of years ago, the last word he mentioned to them was coraggio, which is the Italian for courage. So I think that's what has to be prayed for.
All right. David, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
It's great to meet you,
Okay.
and thank you for sharing your witness. And our prayers are with you and
Thank
your
you.
continued witness
Thank you.
For our Lord and His church. Thank you for joining us on the journey home. It's always a pleasure. God bless. See you again next week.